So we've gotten to the divided kingdom period. Now, due to time restraints, we won't be able to go through everything that there is here, and we're going to be jumping around a lot. So just so that we're all on the same page, who knows why the kingdom divided? Can anyone answer why there is a northern Israel and a Judah now in this time period? They did start to do that, but it was after the split that they really started to do that. That was when Jeroboam didn't want them going down to Jerusalem to worship, so he made his. Yeah, good point.
Essentially, it's fear. Rehoboam didn't trust enough in God that he was going to get the key to the kingdom he was promised there.
So what did Rehoboam do?
He started more or less setting up their own, you could say, religion up there, similar to the Jewish religion, but quite different.
Well, what did Rehoboam do? You said he was scared that he would lose the kingdom.
Yeah.
What did he do to propagate this split?
He set up worship up in his own kingdom.
Well, that was Jeroboam, sorry. Rehoboam is Solomon's son of Judea. Jeroboam is the Israel king. So what did Rehoboam, Solomon's son, do to initiate the split? Anyone?
So he didn't listen to the wise counsel to give in to Israel's demands of, hey, don't be so harsh on us like Solomon, as far as providing all the tribute that they will to the king. If you make it easier for us, it'll be your service forever. But the young man of his friend said, no, tell him that you're going to be, Solomon was my little finger, and I'm going to be, much heavier and harsher on you. And that's what really said, we're out of here.
Yep. He was, in his rise to the throne, his ceremonial speech for that, he did say, I'm going to be harsher than my father. I wonder if that's because Solomon was such a great king, he felt he had to do something like that. But we actually know before that this is going to happen. God prophesies that this happens. Why does God prophesy? Why does God tell us this is going to happen? We know the mechanism by which he made it occur, but why? Mm-hmm. These were the mechanisms with Rehoboam, but the reason for that is because Solomon and his foreign wives. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with that. The first one we're going to be focusing on is the northern kingdom with King Omri. Who was King Omri? Does anyone remember that? What does the Bible tell us about King Omri?
Father of Ahab.
Father of Ahab. Yeah.
Who's more famous, but
At least biblically.
infamous.
Yeah. Was he a good king, bad king? Bad king, yes. That's a trick question. All these Israel kings are bad kings. But the Bible tells us a little bit more. Not a lot, but a little bit. He was the commander in the army of King Elah. He was the king prior to him, or one of the kings prior to him, not the one just prior. But King Elah had reigned for 2 years, and he was assassinated by Tirzah, his chariot commander. So you have Omri as the commander of the army, and Tirzah as the commander of the chariots. So basically, 2 different branches of the military, and one of them is throwing a coup. So Zimri took the throne. Well, Omri didn't like that, so he goes and he besieges the city. Sorry, I said Tirzah is a person. Tirzah is the place. Zimri is the person. I just want to make sure I'm correct in saying that. But Zimri, the chariot commander, took over Tirzah, the capital at the time, thinks he's going to lose, so he burns down the whole thing. He says, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home. And he burns himself to death. So then Omri is the one that rules. No, he has to deal with another guy by the name of Tibni, and they have another kind of civil war. So there's a lot of turmoil when Omri takes the throne. He's the one that's left on top, primarily because of his support from the military. We find that this is going on at this time. Now, this is still relatively early in the Israelite kingdom. We had Jeroboam, who was the first king of Israel, then Nadab, Baasha, and Elah. So we had 4 generations of Jeroboam, basically. Then Zimri, and then finally Omri after beating Tibnah to the punch. Now, we can connect this with what we know of archaeology, with Omri reigning from 885 to 874. And this is a period of stability for Israel, and the kingdom begins to expand. While ever since the divide, Israel's whole history is basically a downward slope. But just like when you look at the stock market, even though it's going to be a downward slope, there are going to be little bumps. This is one of the little bumps, at least from a worldly point of view, in terms of the kingdom of Israel. He was a stable king. He expanded the kingdom a bit. They still have all the benefits that Solomon made for the kingdom, that David made for the kingdom. Moab is still a vassal state to Israel at this time. Well, one thing we know about Omri, in addition to this, is he then moved the capital. So in 1 Kings 16, it says, in the 32nd year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel. And he reigned for 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tirzah, and he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. And he fortified the hill and called the name of the city that he built Samaria, after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. So we see the Bible telling us the movement of a new capital of the state of Israel, of the northern kingdom. And we do have this located today. Today it's called Tel El Farah. Omri was a wicked king, and we don't have much more information about him than this, about 12 verses. But what is important to God and what is important to man are two different things. While we don't know a lot about him in the biblical account, we do know more about him in the archaeological account. We have his capital here, his first capital, and there we find a palatial structure that was destroyed by fire. Complete in agreement with the biblical account. We see that Omri actually started to rebuild this palace. We see a main building with a central courtyard surrounded by 3 larger rooms. Sorry, I'm a little cough here. But that's very similar to what Saul's palace was like. A central courtyard with surrounding towers. And the stone dressing resembles the masonry in the palace at Samaria, so showing that they are related culturally and time-wise. We suddenly see that the construction was halted, and we see abandoned building materials, partly dressed stones. So for some reason, which neither the archaeological or the biblical account tells us why, he moved to Shemer, to Samaria, and made that capital there. We do know where this is, of course, because Samaria is a well-known city. Unfortunately, King Herod decided to build a temple over this palace. We do have some remains of it. We can see that it was there. We can see that Ahab, his son, expanded it, potentially. We don't know for sure it was him. The Bible tells us that he did some expansion, did some building, but we don't know if what we see is from him exactly, or it could be from one of the other kings. And you see the picture there? That, unfortunately, is not Omri's capital, Omri's palace. That is the Herodian temple. I believe it's Caesar Augustus. I have that written somewhere else in the PowerPoint. But unlike Jerusalem, this was a compound. This was a fortress. This was not a sweeping city. And here it is from an aerial view. You can get more pictures of this at Bible Places. I believe Todd Bolin is the person in charge for that. But this right here, that structure, unfortunately, that is the Herodian temple. You can see a little bit of Omri's palace up close, but unfortunately, a lot of it was destroyed in that King Herod's construction. But outside of Israel, we see even more of Omri. Omri left a lasting impression. In the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, this is speaking about Jehu, which we'll talk about here in a bit, but it says that he was of the dynasty of Omri. Now, we know biblically that's not true. He is not related to Omri by blood. In fact, he undid Omri's line, but he is still connected to Omri. In fact, Israel, the state of Israel, is called Omri land. And this is about 100 years after Omri's reign. So while the Bible doesn't tell us much about him, he had a very influential rule in regards to the countries around Israel. From a worldly point of view, he probably would have been considered a good king. He did some things that built up Israel, that financed Israel, that brought stability to Israel. But what makes a good king from the world's point of view, it does not mean that they are a good king from God's point of view. This is true of any leader. And what is important to God, what he gives us in the Bible, isn't always important to man. But when we see the human account and God's account, whenever they both speak, they are in agreement as far as what happened. The human account will give us other information, like Israel being called Omri land. The Bible will also tell us other information that's not found in the archaeological account. And sometimes they both don't tell us what happened. You'll see this a lot. But any questions about Omri before we move on to the next king? Okay. Who was King Ahab? We already mentioned it a little bit, that Omri was his father. Do we know anything else about Ahab? Was he a good king, bad king? What? Bad king, all right. Why was he a bad king? What was that? Jezebel? He had a bad wife, bad company, and all that. Anything else? What did he do specifically? Who was he very antagonistic with? What major prophet? Elijah. Yeah, a lot of what we know biblically is between him and Elijah. As far as timeline goes, Solomon died about 930 BC. Omri began to rule 885. Ahab begins 874. So this is about 60 years after the divided kingdom. Not long. People would have still been alive, potentially, that could have remembered the united kingdom, that remembered the schism. But he is called the most wicked king of Israel. Excuse me. We know a few things extra-biblically that he did. In the Kirk monolith of Shalmaneser III, this is an Assyrian text, basically he involves himself with a coalition of Western kings that take a battle near Karkar in the modern-day Syria. Now, we see Ahab give 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers to this battle. And they are on the same side as Aram, which we do see that occurring later in the Bible after they fight. Now, this would have been near the end of his reign. And that's exactly what we see as far as the relationship with Aram in the Bible, at least until there's some paying off going on. Well, this is when Assyria basically takes over. And it seems that Assyria makes Israel somewhat of a vassal state at this time. We don't really have much information about that biblically, but it seems that Israel is put underneath the thumb of Assyria. Now, this does make sense with what we know biblically. We'll go more into the details of what happened and Assyria's point of view when we get to that. But here is the little monolith that shows about this battle. But before we get into that, I do want to mention the capital because he does build that up, and we do have some remnants of that. We have here his ivory palace and a piece that may have come from that. This is a decorative furniture and wall inlay, so this would have been put into a piece. It is called a striding sphinx, and it is very Phoenician. Now remember, we do see some Phoenician influences coming into the architecture at the time of David and Solomon. So this may be because of that. Or it could be because of his wife, Jezebel. She was a daughter of a Phoenician king. And as such, she brought a lot of stuff with her, including pagan worship, which is a big problem for Ahab, as that caused him to want to kill all the prophets of Israel. So we see this showing that his palace was there. Now, we don't have much else as far as the ivory goes, maybe because Amos 3:15 says that God is going to destroy the houses of ivory and such like that. All right. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say for Ahab right now. We'll get more into his battles with the foreign kings when we talk about the foreign kings, because we have a lot more from their point of view as far as Israel and its relationships. We may get that today. We may get that next time. Like I said, we're going to be jumping around a bit here. Next, King Jehu. Does anyone remember King Jehu? There's one note in the Bible that tells us about him that doesn't really seem to, seems kind of odd that the Bible mentions it, but do you remember what it was? How does he, what? Say again, I can't hear you. He was a wild chariot driver, yeah. He drives like a maniac, which I feel it's weird that they mention it, but everything's in there for a reason. I just don't know that one. Yes, he drives like a maniac. He also does quite a bit. So he existed in the 9th century BC of the Northern Kingdom. He served as the commander in the armies of King Ahab. 2 Kings 9:20 is when he drives like a maniac coming back. But he's doing all this. He becomes king because God told him to strike down the house of Ahab, your master, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants, the prophet, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord. So Jezebel, through her husband Ahab, caused a lot of people faithful to God, the prophets of God, to be killed. Instead, they tried to worship Baal instead. Well, Jehu is pretty fervent about his work. He kills Joram, king of Israel. He kills Ahaziah, king of Judah, because he was being buddy-buddy with Joram. He kills Jezebel, the queen mother. He killed all those loyal to Ahab's house. He caused other people to kill Ahab's 70 sons, or Ahab and Joram's, anyway, the line of Ahab, and he killed all of Baal's worshipers. So he was very fervent at the beginning. And as reward, God promised that he would rule, his generations would rule for 4 generations. His dynasty would rule for 4 generations. But he himself reigned for about 28 years, from 841 to 814. Jehu, we know, ruled from Samaria. He may have expanded it. We don't know who made the expansions that we see. Again, because Herod built his temple to Caesar Augustus and destroyed this. Another thing we have is that Jehu destroyed Baal's temples, their worship places. We do not have evidence of this archaeologically, but we do have similar events archaeologically, such as this from King Hezekiah. They made the temple a latrine. And just for your information, that is what a toilet looks like at this time and period. So be thankful for indoor plumbing and porcelain. But we don't know where this was. We don't know where Jehu did this. But by doing so, by destroying things and making it a latrine, they are showing that this is no longer sanctified. This worship center, this deity, this pagan idol is no longer considered sacred. We've seen other places where they have buried something. They've buried an altar. They have buried a place. That is showing reverence, saying that we don't need this anymore, but we do not want to destroy it, so we are going to bury it reverentially. This is the extreme opposite, showing that they want no connection with this place. We do have mention of him elsewhere. We already talked about the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, mentioning Omri land. Well, this actually may be King Jehu here. Not either of the 3 that's standing up, but the man down here on the floor. What they were to do when they were showing fealty to a foreign king, when they were admitting that they were a vassal state, they would come and they would have their messenger bring a message and do something akin to groveling, something very embarrassing. But because of this, we think this actually may have been King Jehu required to do this because of what is mentioned in this black obelisk. He was required to do this in his undergarments. You can see he is dressed differently. Thankfully, he is still fully clothed in this, but still this would have been very embarrassing to come in as what, basically, your underwear. But he had to do this because Israel was a vassal state. After Ahab died, Israel began to decline significantly. We know that Moab begins to rebel after Ahab's death. This may be because Assyria was taking over and becoming more in power, basically putting Israel under its thumb, and Moab thought that they could take advantage of that, which they did. But we further see Israel begin to decline after this. We also have Jehu mentioned in the annals of Shalmaneser III. We're recording the tribute that Jehu gave, the Kerbali statue of Shalmaneser III. This records his victory over Hazael, the Aramean king of Damascus, which is mentioned in the Bible several times. And I do want to make a note here that we are getting a number of dates. Remember, the Assyrians were very good calendar takers. They recorded events very precisely. Each year had a different name. And so not only do we get a connection to the biblical chronology from the destruction of the temple, we are getting connections to the biblical chronology with each of these kings. And they all are in near perfect agreement, meaning that we can be fairly confident that what this says here and what the Bible says are in agreement. And when you have 2 things that agree, you can be fairly certain that both are accurate. The more you have an agreement, the better you are. And it's not just 1 or 2 places. Each king, each mention extra-biblically of these kings connects the biblical chronology. So we can be very confident that what the Bible tells us is correct. We also have mention here of the Battle of Poikar, or Karkar. And then that's it for King Jehu. Now, any questions on King Jehu before we go to the next king, the last king of Israel, both in this presentation and in history? All right. The next is King Hoshea. This is the last king of the northern kingdom. Besides that, what do you know about King Hoshea? Was he a good king, bad king? What? What? There we go. It's not that early, guys. Come on. Yeah, he was a bad king. And he became king about 732 to 723. Now, Israel has been split for some time. This is about 200 years of splitting between Israel and Judah. Now, Hoshea is still paying tribute to Assyria, and we have here a seal from his reign. Now, it is from one of his servants, Abdi, servant of Hoshea. But you can see a sun disk, and this looks almost Egyptian-like. We are seeing a lot of extra Israelite influence here. We're seeing a lot of Phoenician and Egyptian influence in a lot of these seals. Excuse me. But the writing is Proto-Hebrew, and that is consistent with this time period, showing that Hoshea ruled about this time period. And it is a good consensus that this is authentic. You have to be careful since some of these are found on the antiquities market, and you cannot be sure of their authenticity. But this one, near a general consensus that it is. Again, just want to note, we can know pretty sure some of these dates because the Assyrians dated each year with a name, each year with a major event. And we can connect those with solar eclipses. We can figure out where those happened in our calendar and then connect our calendar to the Assyrian and the biblical calendar with this effect. We see a description, number 4, in the deeds of Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, which we will talk about as well. The land of Bit-Humria, Omri land, or Israel, all of its people, Assyria, I carried off. Pekah their king, Ild, and Hoshea I appointed over them. What is in parentheses is lost. We don't have that in the account here from the Assyrian because of damage. But this gives us a little bit more information about what the Bible says. 2 Kings 15:30 says, Then Hoshea the son of Elah made a conspiracy against Pekah the son of Remaliah, and struck him down and put him to death, and reigned in his place in the 20th year of Jotham son of Uzziah. This is showing the reasoning behind Hoshea, that he had backing from the Assyrian king. Remember, Israel is a vassal state at this time. The Assyrian king wanted Hoshea on the throne for some reason. We don't know why. So it gives us a little bit more information about what is happening in the Bible, showing us what is happening outside Israel. Still, Hoshea was the one that did all this, and he made the conspiracy, but this shows that he had backing of the Assyrian king. Excuse me. And it also makes sense when Hoshea then rebels, because we see a new king take over the throne in Assyria, and Hoshea thinks this is his chance. He is no longer under the thumb of Tiglath-Pileser III. He is now under the thumb of someone else, and he thinks that he can take advantage of this. And as such, he turns to Egypt. This is most likely the pharaoh Asokan IV. Unfortunately, this was not to be, and Assyria then comes in and gives swift retribution. They lay siege for about 3 years, and eventually Samaria falls due to Shalmaneser V. We can see the Babylonian Chronicle, ABC 1, records the reigns here, and we see references to Shalmaneser ravaging Samaria. This would have occurred about 725 to 723 BC. Now, this is talking about Shalmaneser reigning for about 5 years, then he dies, and Sargon II took over. Now, sorry, I misspoke there. 725 to 723, the sections are damaged, and the biblical texts basically help fill that in as far as what occurred. Now, there is one question, because there is something that doesn't match up perfectly with the biblical and the Assyrian account. In the Assyrian account, Sargon II is the one that claims to be the person who defeated Israel and did the final deportation. And on the surface, this seems to be a contradiction. So let's dig a little bit deeper. The biblical text originally says that Shalmaneser was the one that came in. But after a while, it just says the Assyrian king. So this may be Shalmaneser, or this may be just whoever was king at the time. Others suggest that Shalmaneser was the one that started the deportation and finished it, but Sargon took credit. Very similar to how we see whenever a new administration comes to power here today, they like to take credit for the good things that the previous administration did. This goes back and forth. Every new administration seems to like to do this, even back in biblical times. This is further strengthened by Sargon appearing to be a usurper. He says, I besieged and conquered Samaria. I took as booty 27,290 people who lived there. I set my governor over them, and I imposed upon them this tribute as the previous king. Now, this claim comes later in his reign, so this is not something he does right away. This is near the end. So he appears to be needed in Assyria at the first part of his reign to firm it up. And then later, he's starting to make claims to help shore up his reign that way. So it may be that he's lying here, that he's just trying to beef up his resume, Or it could be that the Bible tells us that Shalmaneser started this and Sargon finished it, which just as the Assyrian king in the biblical account. Remember, this was a 2 to 3 year siege. Things could happen in that time. And so basically, okay, I know what I was saying here. So regardless of which is correct, both do fit both accounts. Both are allowed. We just don't know for sure which is the more accurate, which is more precise, I should say, not accurate. But both do agree that they came in and took the people out. They came in and took Israel away. But we don't have any mention of what happens to them. So, again, I want to mention, sometimes we have more information in the human account. Sometimes we have more information in God's account. When they both overlap, it does fit. While we are at some uncertainty about who was the final deportation, we know that Shalmaneser started it. The Bible says just the Assyrian king, so it could fit both Shalmaneser or Sargon II. Sargon likes to take credit, but that's suspect at best. So, unfortunately, this may be one of the things that neither one gives us precise information on. And that's the case with a lot of this, is that sometimes what is not important to God is also not important to man, or doesn't survive to the modern age. So there are still some things that we just won't know. Any questions on that, Israel, or anything before we go on to the kings of Judah? Okay. So now we're going to focus on the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. But before we get into the kings, we're going to talk a little bit about Lachish. This is a major city for Judah at this time. Prior to this, it wasn't really that important. We don't see a lot of mentions of it. We do see a few in Joshua, but we don't really hear about it since then. We know Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, built it up as well as a number of other places. You can see where it is here as well as an aerial view of it today. We have first mention of this in the conquest period. We see that it was destroyed in the 12th century. We know Joshua came in and killed its king and killed everyone there. But just like Hazor, it seems that people came back. That being said, we don't know if those people were Israelite or who destroyed it in the 12th century. We know it was destroyed at that time period. And since then, it was abandoned for 200 years. The next time we hear mention of it is when Rehoboam is ruling. We then see that Sennacherib conquers that in 701 BC. We'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. And then at the time of the Babylonian invasion, it is again a very important city. It was a heavily fortified city. You can see what it may have looked like in the past. It was a huge complex in a very defensible position, a very important position in Israel. We can see in the excavations, this layer here, level 5, is Rehoboam's layer. We see the wall that he built as well as a little drain there. This is on the northern slope of Lachish. And this does date to the 10th century due to olive pits. So again, carbon-14 dating isn't always our enemy. If you use it correctly, it can be beneficial. We also see some destruction at the time of Sennacherib in 701 BC, when he besieges Lachish and destroys it. We see a number of bulla. We can date it by the olive pits and the pottery. But now, since we're talking about Lachish at this time period with Sennacherib in 701 and all these bulla, I have to mention that we do have King Hezekiah's seal, because he was the king at this time. And this is his seal here. It was not found at Lachish, but it was found in Jerusalem. We know that at this time, from Isaiah 37, as soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. And he said to Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and the senior priests, covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos. So we have Hezekiah ruling at this time. We have his symbol here. And we have him interacting with Isaiah. And we may have Isaiah's seal as well. Isaiah, basically, his seal is about 2,700 years old, found in the Temple Mount area in 2018. This is in the same batch of bulla that Hezekiah's seal was found in, which makes sense since they were not only contemporaries, but they exchanged a lot of letters back and forth. So it makes sense that when you send a letter to somebody, you keep a copy, that's what they did back then, and then you keep the copy that you get, and they would store them together so you can follow the conversation. And this is his seal, or I should say most likely. There is a bit damaged here, but we can easily see Isaiah and 3 of the 4 letters of the word prophet. And based upon the size of the seal, it makes near perfect fitting to get that last letter in there. There has to be another letter there based upon the size, based upon the spacing. And prophet is the best word for that. So this is very likely Isaiah's seal. Now you can tell there's a difference between Isaiah's and Hezekiah's. Hezekiah's has a little sun disk there, that little circle with wings. That may be from the early part of Hezekiah's reign, because we find later that Hezekiah does a lot of religious reform. He tries to bring everyone back to God. And he does a very good job of that as far as destroying all the pagan and occultic stuff. Now, this symbol also can mean rulers. Kings like to have this symbol, and even our own modern aircraft tend to have a similar symbol to this. Now, as far as the modern aircraft, that could just be coincidental. It's just a circle with two wings. So maybe it was from this, maybe it's just a similar design. We don't know what that means. We just know that Hezekiah has this, and this was a relatively popular emblem to have on a well-to-do person's seal. Isaiah's, though, just has writing. Now, as far as kings go, who was King Uzziah? Does anyone remember who that was? Good king, bad king? There's two answers, and they're both right. So he reigned 52 years. First part, he was a good king. He was faithful to the Lord. The second part, he was not. After his mentor's death, he gets very proud. He goes in and tries to offer incense to God in the temple, and as such was struck with leprosy. And he basically had a co-regency with his son for the rest of his rule. But we have here two seals from his reign. We have Abiu, servant of Uzziah, and Sebniu, servant of Uzziah. This is Sebniu's, the seal as well as its impression. Now, both of these came from the antiquities market, so there is a little suspicion about them. But they are from the 1800s, where forgery was not very easy to do. And so this would most likely be an accurate representation of a seal of this time. We also have mention of an earthquake in the reign of King Uzziah. Amos 1:1. The words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, what he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah and Jeroboam was king of Israel. And we have a lot of evidence for this earthquake. This was a major earthquake. We see broken pottery, tools, even walls collapsing during this time. The walls of Gath collapsed. All of this pointing to an 8th century earthquake. And this is many other locations in the Levant. By studying this, though, we can see that this wasn't actually just one earthquake. This was two earthquakes in quick succession. So it may have felt like one major event, and it was one major event, but it was two large earthquakes, with the larger being 7.8 to 8.2. So it was a massive shaking of this area, which explains why so much was damaged. We also have Uzziah getting involved with Tiglath-Pileser III, the king of Assyria. Now, this is also, well, I'll get into that later. Now, he's not really getting involved with them. He's just being mentioned by him, I should say that. So 19 districts of Hamath, together with the cities of their environs, on the shore of the sea of the setting sun, who had gone over to Uzziah in revolt and contempt of Assyria, we assume. Now, that's a different name from that, but both names are used for him in the Bible. So this is his other name. It happens a lot. A lot of people have two names. Now, we don't have record of this necessarily, but it does make sense with his expansionist policy. But in doing so, he's getting put on Tiglath-Pileser's radar. In 2 Chronicles 26, we hear that he went out and made war against the Philistines and broke through the wall of Gath, the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod. And he built cities in the territory of Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines. This may be a reference to this. So these two things may be talking about the same thing. Sea of the setting sun, Western Sea. But we don't know that for sure. Either way, it still makes sense that they're upset with him for expanding. We also see that he liked to build things out in the desert. He was a good fortifier. He built a valley gate, the corner gate of Jerusalem at the valley gate at the angle, and fortified them. He built towers in the wilderness. He cut out many cisterns, which you can see there. Basically trying to build up Judah with fortresses and cisterns. He was trying to really protect his people, his kingdom. And we even have his funerary inscription. Now, this, of course, isn't his original funerary inscription, but this was found in a Russian Orthodox monastery at the Mount of Olives. It was discovered in 1932, or I should say rediscovered, since it was found in a monastery. It says, "Here we brought the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah. Do not open." Evidently, someone did not listen to that, because we don't have the bones or anything else with it. We just have the lid. And this dates to about the time of Christ, a little bit before, a little bit after. So this isn't his original funerary inscription. But it shows that basically they took Uzziah's bones and tried to remove them, tried to relocate them, showing that he was a real person to them. Unfortunately, we don't have where they moved him to or from, just because it was rediscovered in 1932. So there's a lot we don't know about this. And that's basically it for Uzziah for now. We'll talk a little bit more about him when we talk about the foreign kings. Any other questions about him before we move on? All right. Next is King Hezekiah. What do you know about King Hezekiah? We have a lot of information about him. Can you think of one thing that he did? Was he a good king, bad king? Pretty good, yeah. That's an understatement, yeah. But he trusted in the Lord like none before or after him. He reigned 1716 to 686, give or take. He had a co-regency with his father Ahaz for a bit, and again, that's his symbol up there. And he did a number of religious reforms, basically trying to bring back people to God. That's because Ahaz, his father, did a lot of things in the opposite direction. His father paid Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria to capture Damascus, basically to help him out. And when he went up there to meet with him, he took a lot of influence from the Damascus pagan cults there. He then brought that back and tried to remodel the temple in such manner. Not exactly a good king. But Hezekiah basically helps to correct some of that. He also is the one that has to stand against the invasion of King Sennacherib in 701 BC. And we have a lot of good information, both biblically and extra-biblically, about this confrontation. There is a gypsum wall relief dating to Sennacherib's rule, 705 to 681 of Nineveh. And this depicts the siege of Lachish. Now, when Hezekiah was confronted with this, he turned to God, and God rescued him. We'll get a little bit more into that, but first I want to talk about his religious reforms. So Ahaz was a very wicked person. He even had his son walk through the fire. Hezekiah evidently took offense at his brother, half-brother, being treated in such a way, and so he turns back to God. He doesn't like what his father is doing, and he turns to God in the extreme, as he should. He even destroys the bronze serpent that Moses built because Israel was bowing down to it as a pagan symbol, as a worship object. We see him destroying altars and pagan worship sites in Beersheba, Arad, Lachish, and Tel El-Hif. We see altars being taken apart and used in a wall. So they are cannibalizing, destroying and cannibalizing altars such as this, meaning that they are no longer considered sacred. And this is where we find the toilet I mentioned before. In Lachish, we find horns of the altar broken off and a toilet placed in the shrine. All this fitting perfectly with Hezekiah's rule. Well, it could be that he doesn't like what his father is doing, not only in the religious sense, but also in the international sense, because he then begins to rebel against Assyria. He doesn't want to be Assyria's vassal state anymore, because his father kind of got him into some trouble. In 2 Chronicles 31, after these things and these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them for himself. And you can see one of the walls there of the fortified cities. Now, we do have this account from the Assyrian texts. And from the Assyrian point of view, in the Taylor Prism there, he claims that, he boasts that he locked Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. And we see a gypsum relief depicting his siege of Lachish. And the Assyrians at this time were not nice people. They were very enthusiastic about their conquests, we'll just say that. But it records that he could not take Jerusalem. And the Bible tells us why. Because Hezekiah turned to God. Because Hezekiah humbled himself, he was able to keep his rule. And you can see here a bit of the depiction of the Battle of Lachish. I believe that is a chariot there, but I could be mistaken. It's hard to make out with that picture. I apologize, at least on my screen. Maybe a little bit better from yours. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the foreign kings, I believe, yeah. So for now, just remember that Hezekiah was the one that was involved in this conflict. Hezekiah also did a number of building constructions. This is Hezekiah's tunnel mentioned in the Kings and Chronicles. It starts from here and brings water from the Gihon Springs down into the next section of Jerusalem. So this is the old section of Jerusalem. This is the new section of Jerusalem with the Temple Mount up here. And it basically brought water from outside Jerusalem into Jerusalem, which is what you definitely want to happen when you're expecting an attack from the king of Assyria. Now, there has been some changes since it was built. We have a different entrance that you can go into, and there used to be a sluice gate that kept the water at chest height, but now it's thigh height. So you can go to Israel today and walk through this tunnel. It takes about a 30-minute walk. The Gihon Springs come from under the steps, or under the stairs, and while you do have to duck, you do have to get through some tight spaces, so it's not for those that are claustrophobic. You can walk all the way through. And these two tunnels weren't actually built in one direction. Sorry, not two tunnels. This tunnel was not built in one direction. It was built from two opposite ends. And while we don't know how long it took for them to build this, we do expect that it was likely within 4 years. Basically, when he started his rebellion and when he expected the attack. Here is the previous entrance as well as what the sluice gate would have looked like, keeping the water high. But here we have the connecting of those two tunnels, or the two teams of those that was digging the tunnel. One team came from the Gihon Springs, came down and met here. Another team from the Siloam Pool came up and dug up there. This was an incredible feat of engineering. And so, I don't know how they did this. We today don't know how they did this. I don't know how they could connect two separate digging sites to such precision. I mean, look, they didn't overlap side to side. They have a little bit of dip there, but that's it. And the entire time, there's a slight sloping to this to get the water to flow. This was a masterful feat of engineering. And we also have an inscription there. Well, it used to be there, I should say. This is where it was. Somebody stole it, but thankfully they managed to get it back, and we have it today as well. But this was not put there by the king. This was not put there by scribes. This was from the workers themselves. We do not have a lot of inscriptions like this in Judah or Israel. Basically, they just didn't do that. That wasn't their culture. A lot of other kingdoms would build monuments and put a lot of information on them, basically singing their own praises. But the workers felt that they had to do this. We already talked about the length of that a few times before, and we don't know why they did this. But I want to read real quick the inscription. The tunnel, and this is the story of the tunnel while the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to the voice of a man. Called to his counterpart, there was a cleft in the rock on the right, and on the day of the tunnel, the stonecutter struck each man towards his counterpart, axe and flowed. So they're describing the final connecting event of this tunnel. This isn't all there. You can see the spaces that I left. I tried to read that and as far as completion as we can without putting anything extra in there. But this was a truly monumental feat. These people were not just some random tribe living out there without any real knowledge or information. They just didn't leave a lot of instructions as far as all their boasting and bragging. That just wasn't their culture. But this was a feat that the workers felt they had to commemorate in some way. Yep.
It also shows something that you mentioned from a period quite a while before this. They seem to be a somewhat literate culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think often we paint this kind of stereotypical Stone Age picture in our mind. Well, the scribes, they could write, and that was it. Nobody else could write. But here we have these stone workers, and apparently they can write.
Yeah. Now, these were not high-class people. These were the people digging the tunnel. These were their laymen. And while we know this wasn't the scribes doing it because it wasn't the same style that they wrote in, but it was their lay people. They had some understanding of writing, at least enough to write down this inscription. And that's where we're going to end for today. Next time, we're going to be talking about the foreign kings. So we will be covering a little bit of this next time as well, and then we'll get into the exile as well next time. Any questions on the kings of Judah or Israel before we finish the class? Any comments, concerns? I do want to make note that there are far more things that you could learn about these kings. I just took a handful, simply for time's sake. And even of those handful, I probably didn't cover everything that we could cover. But doing 400 some years in 1 or 2 classes is not an easy feat, so I apologize for that. Otherwise, thank you.